Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the papal palaces and shadowed conclaves of medieval Rome where wearing the white stole was more trial than triumph. Forget the images of divine authority and golden mitres in frescoes. The real burdens were endless political intrigues, with secular kings, crushing debts of crusades and threats both mortal and spiritual. Every papacy faced its own storms, so let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now light a candle, bow your head, and let's unlock the perils of the papacy together. You stand in the dim antechamber of the Lateran Palace, your cassock heavy on your shoulders, and the walls echoing with hushed prayers. Moments ago, the Dean of the College of Cardinals announced your name, and the hall burst into ringing bells and chant. You made your way through rows of scarlet robes and bowed heads until you reached the high altar. A trembling hand accepted the papal ring and the keys of St. Peter. You learn that elevation to the papacy robes your life in authority and uncertainty in equal measure. You kneel as the cardinal protodeacon places the tiara upon your head. The triple crown feels rigid and cold like a weight of stone. You rise and feel its pressure on your neck and spine. The high jewel-encrusted rim bears down as though it carries the sins of the world. You sense the eyes of every Christian across Europe turned upon you. You learn that spiritual power yields no comfort, only the burden of souls and the fear of failure. You step from the sanctuary into the sunlit courtyard, heralds in fine brocade-tolled trumpets and cry your title. You hear cheers from the assembled crowd and see banners of cities and kingdoms. Yet you also glimpse the faces of cardinals whose votes you earned through promises, and whose loyalty you must now secure through vigilance. You learn that temporal power follows swiftly upon spiritual authority, and that every kingdom eyes the new pontiff for advantage. That evening you retire to your private study and shut the heavy doors against both fanfare and conspiracy. The carved wooden desk holds the register of tithes and correspondence from kings and princes. A single candle flickers. You untie the cord that binds your doctoral tassels and rub your weary temples. You remember every whispered promise you made on the ballot, and every vote you bought or borrowed. You learn that unworthy election haunts every pope, and that the fear of usurpation can outpace the comfort of robes. You open the register and find the names of distant bishops awaiting your confirmation. You feel the weight of each signature as it shapes the church's future. You learn that one stroke of your quill can bless or condemn entire dioceses. You pause at the ledger of crusade funds where coffers often run empty despite vows sworn at crusader oaths. You sense the pressure from kings who demand both spiritual sanction and financial support for their armies. You learn that the Pope leads not only a flock of faithful, but also a treasury of obligations. In the small hours, you stand at the window overlooking the city. The lights of Rome glimmer below like stars fallen to earth. You feel a chill in the night air. You recall the coronation rituals in which you pledged to uphold doctrine and to protect Christendom. You wonder whether you possess the wisdom and virtue to guide the faithful, or only the ambition that carried you here. You learn that the Pope's greatest burden lies not in the crown of gold, but in the crown of conscience. When dawn breaks, you will lead Mass at St. Peter's. The throngs of pilgrims will fill the square, and the clergy will process in silken robes bright with embroidery. Yet you will perform the same gestures you learned as a simple cardinal. You will trace the sign of the cross and lift the consecrated wafer. You learn that beneath the weight of the triple crown, the act of service remains the same, and that true spiritual authority lies in humility even when crowned in splendor. You awaken to the soft murmur of morning prayers drifting through the vaulted corridors. The weight of the tiara still presses on your skull as you cross the threshold of your chamber into the hallway. Servants bow and whisper your new title, but you feel only the strain of endless expectations. You learn that even in rest, a pope bears the chains of authority that bind his every breath. In the private chapel, you kneel before the altar and offer a quiet prayer. You ask for guidance and for the strength to fulfill your vows. Yet you know that faith alone cannot ease the burdens that await you in the world below. You learn that the spiritual duties of a pope carry echoes of temporal conflict, and that the soul of Christendom rests on your frail shoulders. After your prayers, you descend to the papal apartments for a simple breakfast. A bowl of pottage made from barley and broth awaits you, seasoned with saffron and parsley. You eat slowly, tasting the comfort in each spoonful, and feeling the irony that you once feasted on lavish banquets when you sat as a cardinal. You learn that simplicity becomes wisdom when power calls for restraint. Your chamberlain enters with letters sealed in red wax from kings and emperors across Europe. You lay out each scroll on the table and read their demands aloud. One king requests the title of ruler of the Holy Land. Another seeks forgiveness for a murder, masked as hunting accident. A third insists on redress for territorial claims lost in past treaties. You learn that every secular ruler sees the Pope as both judge and prize, and that your pen and seal shape the fate of thrones. You summon your chancellor, and the cardinal known for his learning to review the correspondence. They argue over canon law and precedent, citing councils and ancient records. You listen as they debate the fine line between mercy and justice. You learn that the chains of authority lie not only in the crown you wear, but also in the books and rulings that limit your grace. By mid-morning, you enter the consistory to meet with the College of Cardinals. You see their scarlet robes folded and draped like shrouds around their frames. Each cardinal approaches you with counsel or complaint. One demands that you reform the curia to end corruption. Another warns that simony remains rampant in every province. A third pleads for funds to rebuild a cathedral in his homeland after an earthquake. You learn that once elevated, you inherit not only power, but also the sins and failures of every predecessor. You speak to the assembled cardinals with a firm voice. You vow to restore integrity to the church, to curb abuses, and to strengthen the outreach to the faithful. They nod, but you see the flicker of doubt in their eyes. You learn that rhetoric can inspire hope, yet rarely overcomes the inertia of entrenched interest. After the consistory, you retreat to the private library. Endless shelves of manuscripts and volumes stretch before you. You sit at a carved desk and reflect on the papal bulls that will bear your name. Each edict must be weighed with care. You must condemn heresy without stifling inquiry. You must condemn violence without abandoning the Lionheart Crusades. You learn that the stroke of your quill can kindle unity or ignite revolt. A knock at the door interrupts your thoughts. The master of papal finances enters, carrying ledgers bound in leather. He lays them before you and reveals that the treasury stands nearly empty. Crusade debts and building projects have drained reserves. You learn that the tiara sits upon a throne of coins borrowed from bankers who expect interest and influence in return. You ask the master of finances for options. He proposes an extraordinary tithe on every archdiocese for 3 years. Another suggests pledging church lands as collateral for loans. A third offers to sell indulgences to raise funds quickly in exchange for church commission. You learn that financial necessity drives moral compromise, and that the Pope's purse strings tie him to choices of grave consequence. As the afternoon sun warms the courtyard, you step into the open to catch your breath. You hear the distant strain of choir singing in the basilica. You close your eyes and recall the day you first donned the cassock. You cherish the promise of guiding millions to salvation. Now you face the promise of condoning abuses to keep the church afloat. You learn that power demands sacrifice not only of self but of principle. Later you walk through the vast recesses of the Lateran Palace with the keeper of the keys. He shows you the private chambers where conclaves of cardinals will gather upon your death. You see niches for ballots, stands for incense, and slots for secret votes. You learn that your demise will set new chains in motion as rival factions vie for the next tiara. At sunset, you convene a meeting with your confessor to unburden your soul. You speak of the decisions that weigh on you, forgiving a heretic, punishing a corrupt bishop, approving a crusade tax. He listens without judgment, offering absolution yet reminding you that absolution cannot undo the consequences of rule. You learn that the confessor's counsel offers comfort yet cannot shield you from repercussions. That night you dine alone, a single candle guttering before your meal of fish and bread. You lift a cup of watered wine and taste both relief and regret. You learn that solitude becomes a companion to every pope, for even in a crowd no one shares the burden of the tiara. Before retiring, you revisit the private oratory and kneel once more with tears in your eyes. You place your forehead on the stone floor and ask for the sainted Peter's guidance. You vow to serve the church and to bear the chains of power with humility. You learn that a pope's true weight lies not only in the crown he wears, but in the vows he keeps when none but God can see. You step into the courtyard of St. Peter's with your fellow cardinals as dusk settles over the city. The heavy doors close behind you, and at once the air grows tense with expectation. Each cardinal carries a folded ballot written in secret, a ticket to choose the next occupant of the throne of Peter. You learn that within these walls friendship gives way to rivalry, and that each paper slip carries the weight of kingdoms. In the cloistered garden you find a small knot of cardinals from the French faction. They whisper in low voices about their candidate's chances. You approach and offer a cordial greeting, though you know every word you speak may be recalled in later accusation. You learn that the conclave demands both courtesy and calculation, that a cardinal's tongue must be as keen as any blade. Elsewhere, a group of Italian princes gather near a fountain, their red robes sweeping the marble floor. They clutch small purses and exchange gold coins for promises of favor. You see one cardinal slip a leather bag into another's cloak pocket. You learn that simony thrives even under a vow of poverty, and that the keys to power can be bought before the doors are sealed. Late that evening, the dean of the college summons all cardinals into the hall to witness the first round of voting. You take your place at the long table, candlelight flickering on the names carved into the wooden benches. Each cardinal steps forward, writes a name, and drops his ballot into the urn. You feel your pulse quicken as you place your own slip into the chalice. You learn that at this moment your faith and your ambition stand side by side. When the urn is opened, the ballots are read aloud. You listen as each name echoes through the hall. No candidate garners enough votes, and the round ends with thin applause. You learn that in the conclave, every failure to elect carries its own meaning, each vote counted like a whisper in a storm. As the hall empties, you find a quiet corridor and overhear two cardinals plotting. They speak of coalitions and of persuading neutral cardinals to join their cause. You learn that conclave politics mirror those of royal courts, and that no alliance remains without fissures. A sudden knock at your door disturbances you. A messenger from the northern faction offers a rare seat at a private supper if you will promise your vote. The message smells of roasted meat and old parchment. You learn that the lure of hospitality in secret rooms can test even the most devout heart. You decline the invitation and speak with the chamberlain of your order. You report the offer and demand an investigation. The chamberlain nods gravely. You learn that maintaining integrity in the conclave requires both vigilance and courage to expose corruption. That night, the cardinals return for a second ballot. By candlelight, you sense tension in every crease of every cassock. You hold your folded slip like a shield. You learn that this ritual, so ancient and holy, can at once unite and divide souls sworn to serve the same cause. You gather once more in the dim expanse of the Sistine Chapel, the frescoes above casting a silent witness over your conclave. The walls ring with the rustle of robes, as each cardinal takes their seat in the circled benches. You feel the stillness settle like dust on every surface. You learn that in this sacred chamber, the fate of Christendom lies in ballots as small as a single folded slip of paper. An usher brings in the brass urn and places it on a covered table. You step forward, hand trembling ever so slightly, and cast your vote. You feel the weight of the fold in your palm and the choiceless freedom as it slips into the cup. You learn that every vote carries both power and burden, for you shape the shape of the church and vow to bear its weight. Between ballots, you retire to an adjoining gallery lit by sconces that flicker like anxious hearts. Here the factions regroup and maneuver. You observe the Spanish contingent whispering among themselves in low tones. They outline their plan to ask for concessions on missions to the New World in exchange for support. You learn that influence extends far beyond Europe and that the papacy holds sway over new lands still unnamed. Nearby, the Italian faction sits around a stone bench, their maps and papal bulls spread before them. They argue that the next pope must preserve the patrimony of the church in the city of Rome and must resist any attempt to move the see elsewhere. They speak with fervor for tradition and for the memory of church fathers. You learn that defenders of heritage can be as determined as crusaders to reshape the world. A sudden noise startles you. The Latin faction has moved to confront the French cardinals, who have been quietly negotiating with the Spanish. Tensions flare. Voices rise until the hall falls. Silent under the weight of the conflict, you learn that in a conclave no quarter is given to courtesy when stakes grow high. At midnight the doors close and the candles burn low. You retreat to a secluded chapel within the Vatican. You kneel before an altar of white marble. You whisper a prayer for guidance and for the wisdom to choose a shepherd worthy of the flock. You learn that in this night of chaos only divine light can guide a heart torn by ambition and by duty. The next morning you return to the vote. The ballots go in one by one and the dean counts them aloud. You hear a name emerge with surprising strength. Some rejoice, others murmur objections. Before the jubilation can grow, the dean announces that no candidate has reached the required 2/3 majority. You learn that for every moment of triumph, there may come a moment of disillusion. You are led out into the cloister where the air is cold and the sky is grey. You sense that the city outside grows impatient. You watch as sullen priests glance upward and merchants peer through windows. You learn that outside the conclave impatience builds and that no pope can be chosen in isolation from the hopes of the faithful. Later in the day, you overhear a heated discussion between the heads of the German and Spanish factions. They accuse one another of seeking to impose a national candidate. You realize that tensions between crowns mirror those within the church. You learn that the papacy is a prize coveted by every realm, and that the conclave becomes a battlefield for secular ambitions. As dusk approaches, the third ballot yields a new result. A compromise candidate who had seemed fringe before now draws unexpected votes. You see the Italian faction shift to support him. You hear the dean count the numbers and realize that a moment of unity has arrived. You learn that in chaos, coalitions shift and that a papal election can end as swiftly as a storm. The dean proclaims the name. A hush sweeps the hall, and then trumpets sound in the distance. You gather once more at the high altar to witness the dean place the white silk and golden tiara upon the new pope's head. You learn that the end of confusion brings both celebration and the sobering memory of how close the church came to division. After the conclave breaks, you join the procession through St. Peter's Basilica. You see pilgrims and clerics bowing and chanting in Latin. You feel the surge of unity, even as your mind carries the memory of the secret conflicts that brought this moment. You learn that beneath outward harmony lies the truth of human ambition and the necessity of hidden strife. Later that evening, you retire to your chamber and retrieve the secret ledger in which you recorded whispered deals and solemn vows. You erase nothing, but you revise only with care for history and for conscience. You learn that a cardinal's honor lies in truth under oath, and in the silent knowledge of what was promised and what was broken. Before sleep, you pen a short prayer of thanks and of warning. You ask for strength to support the new pontiff, and for forgiveness for the intrigues that stained the election. You vow to serve the chair of St. Peter with loyalty and with the humility denied in the conclave. You learn that the true duty of a cardinal begins when the chapel doors open and the world demands unity where yesterday there was only faction. In that moment, you feel the tiara's weight upon your brother in Christ, and you realize that although his burden is great, yours remains as well. You learn that conclave chaos gives way to the calm of service, and that every cardinal must set aside ambition to lift the church toward its calling. You awaken to the sound of trumpets and horn calls echoing through the Vatican's courtyard. Through your window you see banners of the Holy Roman Emperor's standards snapping in the morning breeze. You learn that when a pope holds the keys to spiritual power, then every secular ruler positions himself at the gate in hopes of shaping the next pontiff. You dress quickly and descend to the palace forecourt. There you find the emperor's envoy, awaiting with a retinue of armored knights and gilded pages. The envoy bows deeply and presents a letter sealed with the imperial eagle. He greets you with words of reverence and goodwill, yet you sense the weight behind his courtesy. You learn that an imperial plea for influence can carry the force of armies in its silence. You take the letter and break the seal. Inside, the emperor promises to defend the church against all heresies, yet reminds you that papal approval is needed for investiture of bishops throughout his realm. He hints that in return for a favorable election, the empire will secure revenues for Rome's needs and guard its borders. You learn that rulers do not ask for favors they need not receive. In the hall, you convene with senior cardinals. You lay the emperor's letter on the table and watch as murmurs ripple through the assembly. The diplomat from France counters with a dispatch from the King of France offering similar concessions. You learn that rivalry among monarchs can drag the church between competing crowns and that every cardinal must navigate these cross-currents. After the assembly, you retreat to a private gallery and meet with the imperial envoy. He pours wine for both of you and speaks frankly. He warns that the empire's patience wears thin when bishops in its lands answer to Rome alone. He reminds you that an emperor who feels slighted may choose to circumvent the papacy altogether. You learn that the threat of secular overreach is never idle while the throne of Peter is vacant. Later that day, a delegation from England arrives. The English king seeks assurance that papal judges will not interfere in ecclesiastical courts upon which his prerogatives depend. He brings coin in silver and wool in bolts. You learn that material offerings reinforce every political proposal. You spend the afternoon reviewing each monarch's entreaties. You compare volumes of treaty obligations with sums of money offered. You see that service owed to the empire outweighs that owed to France. You learn that a pope's ledger balances not only souls, but also the accounts of powerful kings. As dusk approaches, you step into the cloister, where cardinals from different nations gather in small groups. Each group speaks in its native tongue about the prospect of securing a pope sympathetic to its realm. You overhear talk of granting privileges in return for votes and of leveraging church lands for secular gain. You learn that despite vows of spiritual unity, the conclave reflects the fractures of Europe's politics. That evening you host a modest supper for the emperor's envoy and 2 trusted cardinals. You serve simple fish and plain bread, but you listen keenly as the envoy outlines the empire's needs. He warns that the empire's support may vanish if the papacy fails to endorse his coronation and his claim to Italy. You learn that the pope's blessing crowns a king's authority as surely as any crown of gold. After the envoy departs, you reflect on the day's encounters. You realize that each monarch covets a pope who will confirm his own doctrines and suppress his enemies. You learn that while the conclave may meet behind closed doors, it cannot escape the gaze of emperors whose glance can decide the church's fate. In the dead of night, you walk the palace gardens with a fellow cardinal from the Italian faction. He tells you of secret letters he delivered to the Neapolitan king who promises to protect the papal states in return for coastal ports. You feel the breeze stir the laurels overhead. You learn that foreign armies wait in every coastal land, and that the papal guard alone cannot defend the borders without secular allies. The following morning, the conclave reconvenes. You sit at the table and notice the expression on your peers' faces. Some show confidence after last night's concline of alliances. Others display doubt at the emperor's demands. You learn that each vote in the conclave carries the memory of every negotiation and of every sealed promise made at midnight. You step forward to cast your ballot. You feel the tension in the audience as each cardinal whispers the name of his chosen candidate. You learn that political pressure bends the ballots as much as faith or merit. In the afternoon, the ballots are counted, and no candidate has reached the required majority. You see frustration flicker across the emperor's envoy's face when he receives the news. You learn that even the might of an empire cannot guarantee a smooth election when church law binds the conclave. Late that day, envoys from both the empire and France request private audiences. You grant them separate meetings and listen to their counsel. They offer bribes of land, promises of protection, and veiled threats of withholding funds for building projects. You learn that every palace servant and every church carpenter depends on the papal purse. As the evening deepens, you retire to your chamber and kneel by the bedside crucifix. You pray for guidance and for the courage to resist worldly sway. You recall the moment you took the oath to serve only God and the Church. You learn that spiritual authority demands the strength to stand against the hunger of secular crowns. At dawn, you return to the conclave and cast your final ballot. You feel both the fear of offending emperors and the duty to uphold the Church's independence. You learn that the Pope's role stands at the crossroads of heaven and earth, and that kings at the gate may beg for influence but cannot inherit the keys to the kingdom of God. The day after the conclave stalls again, you find yourself in the Sala Ducale receiving the envoy of the King of France. He wears silk and velvet and carries a chest of gold coins encrusted with fleur-de-lis. As you rise to greet him, he bows deeply and proffers the chest. "For the support of Holy Church," he says softly. You feel the weight of that offering not only in your palms, but in every expectation it carries. You learn that kings court the papacy as an ally, and that a single sack of coin can echo through corridors of power. You accept the gift with solemn thanks, and lead the envoy to the map room. You spread out parchments, showing the routes of pilgrimage from Paris to Rome. The envoy traces his finger along the pilgrimage road, and reminds you that in return for papal favor, he will protect pilgrims and fund repairs to way stations. You hear the unspoken promise that his army will come to the defense of the Church if you endorse his claim to Brittany or to territories elsewhere. You learn that political favor flows both from sanctified office and from armed support. Later, you meet with the envoy from the English king in a private gallery. He presents you with rare tapestries woven with scenes of saints and martyrs. Their colors rival the sunset over the Tiber. You ask him what his sovereign seeks. He bows again and says that English bishops owe allegiance to Rome yet suffer interference by the crown. He asks you to reaffirm the Pope's right to appoint prelates without royal consent. You learn that in every realm the sovereign tests the boundary between church and crown, and that the papacy must choose whether to contest or to accommodate. As the afternoon shadows lengthen, the imperial envoy returns with a fresh message. He broaches the subject of matrimonial alliances between the imperial house and the papal kin. He suggests that your niece or nephew might wed into the family of the emperor in return for sacred investiture rights. You learn that royal bloodlines become coins in political commerce, and that every match broaches both alliance and subservience. That evening you convene a small gathering of cardinals favored by each crown. They cluster like moths around 3 flickering lamps. The French faction speaks of renewing crusade fervor with French knights led by papal blessing. The English contingent counters with a proposal for maritime patrols north of Rome to curb piracy. The imperial group insists on reaffirming the rights of imperial lands in Italy. Each cardinal speaks with fervor, as though the Church's unity rests on his words. You learn that secular interests dive into conclave politics as fish into a school of water. A sudden knock at the door brings the Grand Master of Ceremonies. He announces that a messenger from the King of Aragon has arrived with a promise to restore church lands seized in Catalonia if the conclave names a pope friendly to Aragonese aims. You learn that even smaller kingdoms jostle for papal attention, and that every foot soldier lost or gained in southern Europe hinges on the Pope's secret ballot. You decide to host a formal audience for all envoys at once in the Sala Regia. The hall's frescoed walls depict triumphs of popes over heretics. You sit beneath the great arch and invite each envoy to speak in turn. The King of France's man requests funding for the next crusade. The English envoy urges support for maritime security. The imperial delegate demands affirmation of imperial rights. The Aragonese envoy seeks restitution of church lands. Each speaks, and each watches your face for a sign. You learn that the Pope must hear every plea without yielding wholly to any. After the audience, you withdraw to your study with your chief advisor. You pore over the texts of former decrees and the clauses of concordats. You balance the promises you have already made against the new demands. You see that French gold cannot pay for English bishops, and that imperial pride cannot tolerate Aragonese claims. You learn that papal diplomacy must weave a tapestry finer than any royal garment. In the early hours, you confer with your confessor beneath a simple oil lamp. You speak of the moral weight of bargaining sacred office for secular gain. He reminds you that the Church's mission transcends politics yet must operate within it. You learn that spiritual authority loses none of its power when exercised with prudence and compassion, rather than with profit or pride. At dawn, you address the College of Cardinals in a solemn consistory. You speak from the heart about the challenges of guiding the Church through storms of royal politics. You recall the gospel command to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and unto God that which is God's. You urge unity among cardinals so that no crown can divide the Church. You learn that words rooted in faith can rally the faithful when power veers toward pride. Later that morning, you dispatch circular letters to every court in Europe. You express gratitude for the offers made and request patience as the conclave continues. You remind kings that a holy election requires prayerful reflection rather than hasty alliance. You learn that the Pope's pen can calm tempers and slow the pace of political horses. Meanwhile, envoys from each kingdom remain in Rome. They dine in guest halls and whisper across polished tables. You gather intelligence from your network of informers and learn of late-night meetings and clandestine agreements. You know that any decision you make will ripple through these secret councils. You learn that the papacy stands at the center of a web so vast that even its threads can tangle beneath the weight of crowns. As the conclave enters its final day, you sense an air of resolution among the cardinals. You hear that a compromise candidate has emerged who enjoys moderate support from both France and the Empire. You learn that kings at the gate may shape the outcome but cannot fully dictate it. When the final vote is cast, you join the cardinals at the high altar for the proclamation. The new pope appears, his face serene beneath the white silk. He raises his hands in blessing and prays for unity and for peace between church and crown. You learn that out of conclave chaos emerges a moment of grace that calls kings to respect the sacred office. In the days that follow, kings and envoys throng the papal chambers to swear fealty and to reaffirm their promises. You witness handshakes and exchange of seals. You learn that the papacy's power lies not only in spiritual authority, but in its ability to broker peace among earthly kings. When at last the conclave opens its doors and the world enters once more, you walk through the crowds in St. Peter's Square with the new pope by your side. You watch as monarchs bow and commoners cheer. You learn that in the end the pope stands above kings not only in faith but also as peacemaker among princes. Yet in the quiet moments you remember the banners at the gate and the weight of coin offered for your vote. You remember the nights of intrigue and the dawns of prayer. You learn that to wear the tiara is to walk a narrow path between heaven and earth, and to wield a power for which kings themselves must bow. You stand in the apostolic chamber before a long table piled high with parchments and coin purses from every region of Christendom. The murmurs of cardinals fade as you enter, their gazes fixed on the ledgers that tell the story of crusading vows and empty coffers. You learn that once the cry, Deus Vult, echoes through Europe, it sparks not only holy fervor, but also an avalanche of debt that threatens to bury the church beneath its weight. Before you lies the record of the recent levy on the Italian communes. Merchant cities, once proud of their independence, now buckle under the demands to fund transport for knights bound for the Holy Land. Each silver piece collected promised passage, armor, and daily sustenance for crusaders. Yet each ducat spent slips through tangled channels of creditors in Lombardy. You learn that the church's coffers become entangled with the bankers' vaults in Siena and Florence, and that every crusade begins with an invisible toll at home. You turn to the accounts from the French provinces. The king pledged vast sums from his domains when he took the cross. His barons and bishops answered the call with generous gifts of gold and grain. Yet, when the muster began, your emissaries found most of that treasure already spent on court entertainments and castle repairs. You learn that in war, nobles too often redirect funds and invest in their own glory before honoring pledges to the church. A messenger arrives, bearing a wooden chest held together with iron bands. Inside you find fragments of a ransom paid to free pilgrims taken captive by Saracen corsairs. The fragmentary receipts speak of so many pieces of eight required to liberate a single group of pilgrims that you feel a pit open in your stomach. You learn that the price of rescue can rival the cost of a full campaign, and that every captive counts as a debt to be repaid by someone, often the poor among your flock. Your chamberlain presents estimates for the upcoming campaign. Transport of ships across the Mediterranean will require funds to hire sailors and to purchase provisions for months of sea travel. You must secure safe harbour fees in Cyprus and the Levant. You see totals written in large scrawls that stretch across entire pages. The sums dwarf the annual revenues of several bishoprics combined. You learn that the Crusade's expenses grow with each geographical mile, and that even a small expedition can swallow fortunes. News arrives that tax collectors in England found half their quotas diverted by local sheriffs. Feudal levies promised by knights were substituted for coin payments that evaporated before reaching the papal legate. You learn that in a land governed by oaths, a simple refusal can redirect the Crusade's flow into private coffers. You summon the treasurer of the Camera Apostolica for counsel. He warns that the papal reserves may run dry by next quarter if you do not renegotiate existing loans. He shows you bonds owed to the great banking houses of northern Italy. The interest alone demands a tenth of your revenues each year. You learn that Christian charity can kindle debts held by private lenders whose only allegiance is to the contracts they hold. Between audiences, you meet with envoys from the Kingdom of Sicily and from the County of Provence. Each offers soldiers and supplies in return for papal indulgences for their soldiers and tithes remitted on their lands. You learn that secular leaders expect spiritual currency in lieu of coin, and that such bargains can relieve immediate strain, yet corrode the moral authority of your office. In the quiet hours before dawn, you pace the gallery of tapestries depicting earlier crusades. Saints and martyrs gaze at you from threads of gold and silk. You recall the fervent sermons that summon knights to the cross and the vows taken before the altar. You learn that zeal cannot fill empty chests nor feed hungry hosts on a foreign shore. At first light, you convene a consistory of cardinals to address the crisis. You speak plainly of the mounting debts and the perils of defaulting on loans. You propose a tithe on all clerical incomes for 3 years to cover the costs owed to bankers and to fund the next garrison in Outremer. You learn that taxing the church's own can spark unrest among princes who view each levy as an affront to their feudal privileges. An aged cardinal from the Iberian Peninsula rises to object. He warns that heavy tithes will impoverish monasteries and parishes already struggling to care for the sick and the poor. He reminds you that charity begins at home. You learn that every demand to feed crusaders abroad risks starving the faithful at home. You counter with a plan to grant exemptions for hospitals and for schools. You ask monasteries to contribute willingly and to receive spiritual credit in return. You learn that voluntary gifts carry more weight than compulsory levies, and that appeals to piety can unlock resources more effectively than edicts. After hours of debate, you reach a compromise. Half the required sum will come from voluntary contributions by wealthy orders, and half from a modest, temporary tithe on clerical estates. You learn that even reluctant generosity can rescue your treasury and preserve the church's mission. Next, you meet with representatives of the major banking houses. You negotiate an extension on the papal notes with reduced interest in exchange for the right to mint new coinage bearing your effigy. You learn that controlling the currency offers leverage at the expense of those who hold your debts. That afternoon, you dispatch letters to every archbishopric and bishopric across Europe. You outline the plan for funding the Crusade's next phase and ask each prelate to oversee collection within his diocese. You learn that entrusting local leaders builds accountability, and that a shared burden fosters unity in a common cause. In the weeks that follow, you hear reports of increased collections. Monks organize fairs to raise funds. Knights ride from town to town to preach the crusade. You see the banners of pilgrimage and of piety fly once more. You learn that when faith and finance align, the burden of debt can transform into the promise of hope. Yet in the night you revisit the ledgers and see the ever-rising totals. The cost of ransoms climbs with every new band of captives held by pirates. The cost of war swells with each mile of coastline secured. You learn that the Crusade's debt never truly ends, and that the Church's role as guarantor stretches beyond the horizon of any single papacy. You kneel before the altar in the private chapel one last time. You pray for deliverance for those in chains, and for mercy for those who struggle beneath the weight of financial pledges. You learn that the burden of funding holy wars lies not only in coin, but in the compassion to ensure that pledges serve both faith and justice in equal measure. As the sun climbs above the city walls, the corridors of the Vatican fill with the clatter of footfalls and the turning of pages in ledgers. The papal chamberlain presents you with the latest report on crusade debts. You learn that every month the Church must find fresh revenue, not only to pay its bankers, but to ransom captives still held in far-off prisons. You open a folder containing color-coded lists of names and sums owed. One entry records 200 marks to free a group of Templar knights seized on the Syrian coast. Another shows 50 marks to release merchants in Tunis. You see receipts from Venice and from Genoa documenting the flow of silver across the Mediterranean. You learn that the Crusade's debt extends across borders, and that every confession of faith carries a price that echoes in private vaults. Although bankers provide immediate funds, a new burden falls on your successors. You see notes dated for repayment in 5 and 10 years. You learn that the popes who follow you will inherit both crusading zeal and the loan agreements you sign under candlelight. In the courtyard, you meet with the master of the mint. He shows you coins stamped with the image of St. Peter and dated to your year of office. You learn that by issuing new coinage, you can inflate the currency to reduce the real value of debts. Yet you also know that inflation angers merchants whose livelihoods depend on stable exchange rates. You learn that manipulating money carries moral as well as practical risks. You ask your treasurer for counsel. He reminds you of the Chamberlain's warning that bankers will refuse further credit if the realm appears to default. He urges caution against devaluing the currency too severely. You learn that every fiscal maneuver to ease debt carries the risk of undermining trust in both church and state. That evening, you join a small group of cardinals in the papal library to pray for wisdom. You open a large volume of canon law and find sections on usury. You learn that charging interest on loans is forbidden by church teaching, yet tolerated in practice. You marvel at the contradictions that arise when holy doctrine meets worldly necessity. You learn that every crusade intensifies the pressure to reconcile faith and finance. After prayers, you speak quietly with a cardinal from the Rhineland. He tells you of peasants forced to pledge their meager holdings to pay crusade taxes. He fears that economic strain will destroy the rural economy and drive many to revolt. You learn that the poor suffer most in the wake of holy wars, and that the Church's call to charity must extend to its own tax policies. You rise at dawn to receive ambassadors from the Knights of Rhodes. They plead for funds to defend the last vestiges of Crusader fortresses. They bring relics to secure indulgences in exchange for gold. You find yourself caught between the sacred promise of protection and the secular reality of empty treasuries. You learn that the Church remains the guarantor of crusading outposts, even as its coffers dwindle. In the consistory, you propose a special commission to oversee crusade finances. You name trusted cardinals to audit accounts, to approve loans, and to negotiate better terms with bankers. You learn that oversight can curb corruption and reduce waste, even if it cannot eliminate the underlying need for funds. The commission meets in a side chamber and debates the best strategy. One cardinal argues for tighter controls on military orders and charities. Another insists on appealing to monarchs for direct contributions rather than taxing clergy. You learn that shared responsibility eases the burden, but complicates authority. A messenger interrupts with a report of fresh captures at sea. 4 French knights were taken hostage off the coast of Antioch. The ransom demanded is large. You learn that new crises arise even as old ones fade, and that the Crusade's debt is neither fixed nor final. You summon the master of the horse and order a horse brought for the Pope's personal travel. You will journey to southern Italy to meet with Norman rulers who control passage to the Levant. You intend to negotiate safe transport and to ask for direct contributions from their wealthy courts. You learn that papal diplomacy in the field can yield funds and forge alliances, but costs both time and risk. The next morning, you depart in a small entourage. You travel by boat down the Tiber, past the Ponte Fabrizio, and into the tidal rhythms of the lagoon. Each wave against the hull reminds you of the sea routes used by crusaders and captors alike. You learn that the waterpaths of Christendom carry both salvation and bondage. You reach the Norman court at Capua by midday. You are greeted with grand ceremony and escorted to a great hall where tables groan under platters of meat and fruit. The Norman prince rises to welcome you and presents a chest of gold as advance payment for passage. You learn that feudal generosity can match or exceed crusade levies, yet only when princely self-interest aligns with papal need. You discuss terms late into the night. The Normans agree to provide safe landing and food for 10,000 crusaders in exchange for an annual tithe on church lands in Sicily. You weigh the long-term cost against immediate benefit. You learn that bargains with regional powers can sustain crusades yet diminish ecclesiastical revenues elsewhere. Returning to Rome, you bring news of the agreement. You learn that transporting thousands of knights will soon drain the treasuries of coastal cities and that new contributions must follow each success. You brace yourself for fresh appeals to the cardinals and to the faithful. In the days before you leave for the next ceremony, you walk alone along the portico of St. Peter's. You gaze down at the domed roofs of the city and reflect on the debt that shadows every crusade. You learn that for all its promise of holy adventure, the Crusade's debt binds the church in chains more lasting than any fortress wall. Later, you stand before the tomb of a Crusader saint and kneel in silent prayer. You commend to his intercession all those who serve and all those who suffer in the cause of the cross. You learn that while the Crusade's financial toll weighs heavy on ledgers, it also bears the burden of human hope and sacrifice. That night you return to your apartments and draft a bull, calling for a Jubilee indulgence to raise funds for prisoners held in Muslim lands. You learn that piety and penance can generate revenues and free souls. yet must be handled with care lest the faithful come to view salvation as a transaction rather than a gift. In the final hours before midnight, you review your finances one last time. You see that despite all efforts, the Crusade's debt remains vast. You kneel before your desk and vow to continue seeking both spiritual and material remedies. You learn that the Pope's role as guardian of the cross requires the courage to carry both cross and purse in equal measure. You awake before dawn to the clang of a distant bell and the soft murmur of French spoken in the corridors. You dress in your papal robes and step onto the marble floor of what was once the Lateran Palace. Instead of Rome's golden light, you now see the soft glow of candlelight in a palace by the Rhone. You learn in that first moment what exile means, the mantle of St. Peter borne beneath foreign roofs and foreign tongues. The day before you set out was filled with sorrow and ceremony. Your coach travelled south through Umbrian hills and Tuscan fields. You passed villages where the faithful wept at the sight of your cross, heading away from the city of martyrs. You learned how deeply Rome's people felt your presence, and how bare their hearts felt now that their shepherd left for Avignon. Crossing the Alps was a trial of both body and spirit. The mules stumbled on narrow mountain paths, and the cold bit through your woolen cloak. You shared bread and wine with guides who spoke of distant winters, colder and harsher than any in Rome. You learn that exile warms no heart and chills no body like the wind of separation. At last you descended into Provence. The air smelled of lavender and olive. You arrived at the palace built by a count who once invited you to lunch in simpler days. The windows looked out over a quiet river swollen by spring melt. You learned that serenity of place can mask the turmoil within a court under foreign thumb. Your first mass in Avignon took place in a chapel crowded with local nobility and few Roman clerics. The choir sang in French and Latin merged like two streams converging in tension. You stood at the altar and consecrated the host without hearing the distant roar of Roman bells you once took for granted. You learned that in exile the familiar becomes a memory, and every rite tastes of loss. In the weeks that followed, you discovered how deep the council's new masters had woven their influence. The Pope of France had granted the count vast privileges, and in return expected your court to follow his lead. Cardinals from the north arrived with letters sealed by the French crown. You learned that each telegram of favour came with the expectation of an echoing vow. Your chamberlain brought reports of taxes assessed on lands once free from French interference. Revenues meant to flow to Rome now filled Arles or Lyon first. You met the master of finances whose ledgers showed tithes diverted to support French garrisons. You learned that papal income once spent on arms now paid for mercenary wages under a foreign banner. French knights were posted at every gate and every road leading to the palace. Guards in steel and mail stood at your private chambers. You felt their eyes whenever you walked the halls. You learned that safety in exile comes at the cost of freedom, and that every path becomes guarded when you dwell within another power. Your audience hall now hosted not only cardinals and bishops, but also local lords seeking audience with Rome in Avignon. They wore silks of the Rhone Valley and spoke of vineyards and olive groves. You sensed in their pleas the subtle pressure to adapt papal decisions to local needs. You learned that exile shifts the axis of influence from universal church concerns to the demands of a single kingdom. The Curia itself changed shape. Offices once held by Romans were filled by Provençals or by clerics from the French north. You saw familiar names disappear from the register of benefices. You learned that a papal court in exile eats its own and regrows with those nearest at hand. In private consistory, you heard French cardinals speak with boldness once reserved for kings. They urged you to support a treaty their king desired, to condemn an Italian city their merchants envied, to fund a crusade launched from Marseille rather than from Brindisi. You learned that exile breeds dependence and that the Pope's pen can become the servant of local ambition. You invited Roman envoys to a private dinner in the gardens. They arrived in travel-worn cloaks and told you of dismay back in the city of St. Peter. They begged you to consider a return to Rome before the church lost its soul to Provence. You learned that even in exile, your presence animated hope, and that absence can fester into fear. At night, you walked alone, beneath the wisteria, in the palace courtyard. You stared at distant hills, etched in moonlight. You remembered Rome's skyline of domes and obelisks, of forums and basilicas. You felt the ache of exile cut deeper than any dagger. You learned that a pope in exile leads a flock without doors to enter. One morning, you received a letter from the Senate of Rome. They pleaded for your return, promising safety and supplies. They offered vast sums to restore the curia's presence in the city. You learned that your voice in Rome still carried weight, and that exile could be reversed by courage and by the will of the faithful. Yet the French king sent word that your safety would be at risk if you returned. He cited threats from rival noble houses and from bandits who roamed the Apennines. You learned that exile can be justified by fear, and that the promise of danger can keep you far from the throne you once sat upon. The wisdom of exile wore on you day by day. You met with envoys from England and Spain, who complained of slow justice and distant authority. They said appeals took months to reach you, and that the distance from Rome sapped their faith. You learned that a pope removed from the eternal city loses both reach and reverence. You penned letters affirming your devotion to all Christendom and asked for patience. You wrote of the shrine of St. Peter in Rome awaiting your return. You learned that words can bridge distance but cannot erase the barriers of geography. When you sought counsel with your closest cardinals, you found them divided. Some urged you to return at once. Others feared provoking a conflict with the French crown. You learned that exile fractures the unity of the curia, and that division can turn the leaderless into warring factions. In the Great Hall, you consecrated a new bishop for a diocese in Germany. The ceremony took place in French and Latin. The new bishop knelt before you and received his ring and staff. You saw in his eyes both gratitude and regret that Rome's grandeur lay so far away. You learned that in exile, papal acts still consecrate, but also remind the world of absence. Months turned to years. You began to see the gardens as home and Provence as safe harbour. Yet each sunrise brought the knowledge that exile remained exile. You learned that a pope's place is defined by the city of his ancestors, and that no palace on foreign soil can replace the cradle of the church. One evening, you convened a secret gathering of cardinals in a small oratory. You spoke of the need to plan a return. You laid out strategies to negotiate with the French crown for safe passage back to Rome. You learned that the path home requires both diplomacy and daring. As you closed the meeting, you felt the weight of sacred duty settle once more upon your shoulders. You learned that exile marks a pope's years with shadow, yet also tempers his resolve to restore the church to its home beneath the 7 hills of Rome. The palace at Avignon hums with activity as your court settles into its new home beneath foreign skies. At dawn, you walk through the corridors and see banners bearing the arms of the King of France hung beside your papal coat of arms. Each flag reminds you that in exile, your independence is a fragile prize held at the pleasure of the French crown. You learn that where once you stood above all princes, now you stand beneath the shadow of a single kingdom. Your chamberlain greets you with a report of the nightly expenses. Food must be imported from Provence, and wrought iron must be ferried from nearby forges. All provisions arrive under French license and pass through French checkpoints. You learn that every loaf of bread and every bolt of cloth depends on the goodwill of local authorities. In the Hall of Consistories, you meet with your closest advisors. The Master of Finances lays out the budget and shows how every coin saved by closing one wing of the palace is spent to maintain guard patrols paid by the French treasury. You learn that in exile your purse strings are held by creditors, and your safety by a host whose loyalty lies first with their own crown. You travel to a chapel built for private prayer and kneel before the altar. You ask for guidance and for courage to speak truth to those who hold your fate. You learn that a pope in exile must balance obedience to the church with resistance to foreign masters. Later that day, you summon the French governor of the papal territory. He enters with deference, but his eyes betray his power. He reminds you that taxes on church lands now go first to regional authorities, with only a portion returned to the Camera Apostolica. You learn that in exile, you have become fiscal hostages to a kingdom whose coffers you once filled with tithes. You call for the governor to meet you in the papal library. You point to historic charters that granted the church lands free of secular tolls. You plead that those ancient rights be respected even in exile. He nods curtly and promises to review the documents. You learn that legal claims carry weight only when enforced by those who hold power over your very walls. In the evenings, you dine in a grand hall lined with French tapestries. Local lords invited by the governor press their demands at your table. One asks for a dispensation to seize church property under the pretext of local security. Another presses for a papal decree favoring the wine trade that benefits southern provinces. You learn that politics here tastes of pepper and of self-interest, and that a pope's voice must weigh moral leadership against political necessity. Your Pennsylvania envoy arrives bearing urgent letters from English bishops. They complain that appeals have slowed to months as all papal judges operate from Avignon. You speak with sympathy and promise to dispatch a judge soon. You learn that distance saps authority and that exile fractures the bonds of spiritual unity you once held so dearly. You retire to your private oratory and open a volume of ecclesiastical history. You read of popes who once faced exile, yet returned triumphant. You learn that exile can be temporary if courage and counsel guide the way back home. Yet you also see examples of pontiffs who died abroad, leaving the church without the leadership needed to restore its seat. That night, a delegation from Rome arrives under cover of darkness. They carry news that the city council has organized a militia ready to escort your return. They plead for your approval of a taxpayer levy to pay their wages. You know that each moral act in exile alters your authority upon return. You learn that even clandestine support must be weighed against the risk of igniting conflict. In private, you meet with your confessor to unburden your soul. You speak of your frustration and of the compromises forced by life in exile. He listens and reminds you that humility often shines brightest where power seems most diminished. You learn that in exile, a pope's moral authority can grow as his temporal power wanes. The next morning, you hold a consistory to name new bishops for vacant sees in Tuscany and Lombardy. You notice that your appointments now come with French seals of approval. You learn that every office you fill cements the connection between church and crown, and that your holy authority bends under foreign will. A courier from Naples arrives, offering fealty and a promise of safe western passage if you lift a ban on a local church council. You learn that exiled popes can bargain with regional princes, yet must trade spiritual authority for temporal favors. In the gardens of the palace, you meet with a cardinal from the Spanish faction. He shares his concern that the French governor consults him first on all decisions. You learn that in exile, rival factions jockey for influence, and that the papacy becomes prey to every court's intrigues. By sunset, you address the faithful in a public mass. In the cathedral built for exile, you preach on the virtue of patience and on the promise of restoration. You see tears on the cheeks of pilgrims who journeyed to attend your mass so far from Rome. You learn that exile can forge bonds of devotion as pilgrims march beneath your banner to witness the church advance under trial. That evening, your chamberlain brings you receipts for the construction of a new chapel in Avignon. You must approve funds for stained glass and for marble pillars. You write your signature and wonder who will pay these craftsmen once your court moves home. You learn that exile demands investments in foreign soil and that each building stands as both monument and trap. In the quiet hours, you walk the palace ramparts and look out over the town lights twinkling against the Rhone. You think of Rome's eternal glow where candles burn before saints in every church. You learn that the end of exile lies in the willingness to endure foreign sessions until the moment arrives to bring the church back to its cradle beneath the 7 hills. You stand in the heart of the Vatican precincts as the sun reflects off the marble facades. Cardinal de' Medici approaches, his velvet robe brushing the cobbles. He offers you a frank nod and slips a sealed parchment into your hand. It contains a list of vacant benefices and the sums offered for each. You learn that sacred offices have become merchandise, and that the keys of St. Peter jingle with coin as much as with prayer. In your private study, you spread the parchment on the carved oak desk. Receipts for bishoprics in southern Italy sit beside promissory notes for abbeys in Burgundy. You see figures in gold florins and crowns of France. You learn that, where once the spiritual worth of a church was measured in souls guided, the new measure is in silver weighed. Your chamberlain enters with a ledger of recent transactions. He points out the sale of the Archdeaconry of Milan to a cousin of a powerful cardinal. He notes that the candidate could neither read Latin nor cite a single scripture verse. You learn that nepotism supplants merit, and that family ties not the church's hierarchy in webs of patronage. A knock brings a wealthy merchant into the room. He carries a chest of gold and a gift of rare incense. He asks for your blessing on his son's appointment to the cathedral school. You sign the dispensation without hesitation. You learn that patronage from the rich can eclipse the needs of the faithful, and that a single signature seals both promise and scandal. Word spreads through the corridors and reaches the benches of the papal audience hall. Cardinals convene to discuss a recent scandal in which a bishop sold indulgences without papal sanction. Letters of complaint arrived from several dioceses. You learn that the sale of forgiveness can become a raucous trade, far from the quiet of confessionals. During the consistory, you hear heated debate. One cardinal demands strict investigation and punishment for those who sell spiritual favors. Another defends the practice as necessary fundraising for building projects and for ransoming captives from Muslim lands. You learn that scandal divides the curia between zealots for reform and pragmatists of statecraft. That evening you walk the loggia overlooking the Tiber. Torches line the riverside. You recall your earlier vows to stamp out corruption and to serve the poor. You feel the weight of every promise made at your coronation. You learn that papal splendor shines in gilt and in gold, but casts long shadows that widen in the courts beneath it. A courier from Rome arrives in the midnight, ichor of torches. He brings a folder of reports on a cardinal who accepted bribes to secure a monastery's tax exemption. You learn that high office offers both prestige and temptation, and that even your closest colleagues can fall prey to greed. You convene a private inquiry in your chamber. You summon the cardinal under suspicion and present the accusations. He protests his innocence, yet cannot account for the flow of lavish gifts from the monastery's abbot. You learn that exposing corruption demands courage, and that truth often hides behind layers of courtesy. With a heavy heart, you strip the cardinal of his offices and order him to return the bribes to the monastery. You learn that discipline in the church can restore some measure of justice, yet cannot purge every stain on its cloth. In the days that follow, you receive pleas for mercy from the cardinal's allies. They warn that his punishment will fracture alliances and provoke revenge. You learn that enforcing reform can breed new revolts, and that a pope must balance justice with prudence. At dawn, you celebrate Mass in the Sistine Chapel. The choir sings beneath Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment. You see the painted souls rise and fall before divine mercy. You learn that the splendor of art reminds the faithful of higher truths, even as the faithful below wrestle with moral decay. After Mass, you meet with the master of the patrimony of St. Peter. He presents plans for repairing basilicas and feeding the poor from church lands. Yet, the funds available fall short because of the sums lost to simony and nepotism. You learn that scandal weakens both treasury and charity. You call for a special Jubilee indulgence in the year to come and pledge that all proceeds will underwrite hospitals in Rome. You learn that ritual acts of repentance can raise funds and restore faith if guided by genuine contrition rather than by the promise of parchment sold. In the corridors, you overhear pilgrims speak of seeing pardons for sale and of needing to pay tolls to gain entry to the friars' confessionals. You learn that ordinary believers feel the corruption most keenly, and that scandal can drive hearts away from the church's embrace. That night you kneel in the private chapel before an image of the enthroned Christ. You confess the failures of your office and pray for the strength to root out abuses. You learn that reform begins within, and that a pope's greatest challenge is not to wield power but to purify it. You convene the consistory again, this time to address the spread of nepotism that has infected every level of the curia. A single name echoes through the hall where cardinals sit in scarlet robes. Bartholomew of Siena, your own nephew once touted as a rising star in ecclesiastical circles. He now holds 3 bishoprics and an abbey in trust, all granted by your hand as pope. You learn that favor shown to kin can corrode the very foundation of justice you vowed to uphold. The master of ceremonies presents the evidence. Bartholomew's letters show that he sold offices in his diocese to the highest bidder, then skimped on the duties owed to the poor and to the church coffers. His sleight of hand appears in the ledgers of several monasteries whose revenues vanished beneath the weight of his claims. You learn that nepotism not only rewards the undeserving, but also strips local communities of the support they need to thrive. You summon Bartholomew to stand before the assembled college. His face, once brimming with confidence, now pales as he beholds your stern gaze. He offers no plea of innocence. Instead, he argues that his actions were meant to cement your family's influence and to strengthen the church in times of peril. You learn that kinship can blind even the most devout to the harm wrought by ambition hidden beneath a cloak of loyalty. A murmur rises in the hall when you clear your throat and speak. You recall the day you elevated him to the bishop's seat and the vow you made to protect the welfare of every soul entrusted to your care. You declare that no family bond can supersede the obligation to serve the faithful and to preserve the church's integrity. You learn that true love for kin demands holding them to the highest standard, not granting them freedom to exploit their rank. You strip Bartholomew of all but one minor benefice and order him to repay the sums hemisappropriated. You assign him to a remote parish, where he may learn humility in service to the poor. You learn that punishment must teach reform, and that exile in service can heal a corrupted heart more than simple removal of rank. Outside the hall, you encounter whispers of surprise and relief. Some cardinals feared that confronting Bartholomew might fracture the balance of power among influential families. Others applaud your resolve and hail the decision as a turning point in the fight against corruption. You learn that moral leadership can unite the wary when it addresses the flaws that all too often hide behind family ties. Word of Bartholomew's fall spreads quickly to every corner of the papal court. You walk the corridors and see clerics straightening their vestments and monks bowing deeper at your passing. The message is clear. Simony and scandal may have grown under your watch, but nepotism will be rooted out in your name. You learn that the echo of a single punishment can cleanse a court of latent vice. At dawn, you meet with your confessor to unburden yourself of regret and fear. You recall your own youthful hope to uplift your family and to see your kin flourish in holy service. You admit that in that desire you failed to consider the damage wrought by placing blood ties above virtue. You learn that confession and reflection guard against repeating old mistakes. Later, you travel to the papal mint to witness the creation of a new coin bearing a motto you have chosen: Servia Deo et Populo, to serve God and the people. The mint master shows you the die he will use to strike each piece. You inspect the lettering and the image of a shepherd tending his flock. You hope that every coin circulated among towns and taverns will remind the faithful that the church's wealth exists to serve, not to enrich the few. You learn that symbols of integrity can wield power when backed by consistent action. Back at the palace, you gather with a small council to design a new code of conduct for all church officials. The document will ban the sale of offices, set strict guidelines for appointments, and require every office holder to take an oath against personal gain. You see the draft laid out on parchment, inked in meticulous script. You learn that lasting reform depends not only on individual conviction, but on rules that guide each successor in good practice. In the evening, you attend Vespers in the private chapel. The stained glass windows cast a mosaic of color across the stone floor. The choir intones a Latin hymn that speaks of mercy and justice. You bow your head and ask for strength to maintain the reforms you have set in motion. You learn that prayer can sustain resolve when the burdens of leadership grow heavy. The next morning, ambassadors from distant kingdoms arrive seeking audience. They bring gifts of ivory, silks, and rare spices. They seek your favor in disputes over territories and trade. You greet them with courtesy, but maintain a firm stance on reform. You learn that foreign rulers respect a papacy that enforces integrity within its own court, and that moral authority can enhance diplomatic influence. One ambassador remarks that he once considered the papal court a place where wealth and lineage guaranteed influence. He now sees a new spirit of fairness and vows to recommend your reforms at his own court. You learn that the fight against nepotism can radiate outward, inspiring change in realms far beyond the Vatican walls. Throughout the day, you receive pleas from local clergy, asking for help to implement the new code of conduct. They share stories of priests who once paid for postings in wealthy parishes, now fearing a return to penury under the new rules. You reassure them that provisions exist for worthy candidates, and that patronage based on merit, not money, will become the standard. You learn that change can provoke anxiety even among the well-intentioned, and that leadership demands both firmness and compassion. At dusk, you walk alone along a shaded colonnade. The moonlight glimmers on the tiled floor, and you recall the long journey that brought you from a hopeful cardinal to a reforming pontiff. You feel both pride in the progress made and concern for the work still undone. You learn that reform is never complete, and that vigilance must outlast any single act of justice. Before retiring, you pen a letter to every diocese announcing the new measures and urging all faithful to support the fight against corruption. You ask the bishops to report openly any violations and to hold their own vassals accountable. You seal the letter with your signet ring and send it forth with trusted couriers. You learn that transparency and accountability extend the reach of reform beyond the palace gates. As the candle burns low, you kneel in the private oratory and pray for humility in leadership and for healing in the church where scandal once held sway. You learn that the path to renewal begins with facing the wounds of the past and committing to the slow work of justice one soul at a time. You stand beneath the vaulted arches of the Lateran Palace as the sun rises on a new dawn for the church. Today you will witness the moment when the Pope proclaims a new power to seek out heresy in the name of saving souls. You have felt the tension in the air ever since rumors spread of a papal decree, granting inquisitors authority to summon any suspected heretic, to question them in private, and to hand down judgments without appeal. You learn that faith and fear now lie entwined, and that a sentence of suspicion carries consequences more lasting than any criminal verdict. In the grand hall, the Pope sits before a long table draped in red cloth. Cardinals lean forward, their faces solemn. A copy of the decree lies in front of him. He raises his hands and speaks of the need to protect the unity of belief against the poison of error. You watch as he seals the parchment with the weight of Peter's ring. You learn that a single signature can unleash an institution whose power will shape Christian lands for centuries. Word of the decree spreads swiftly through the corridors. Servants pause in their tasks to whisper news of the new tribunal of faith. Monks lock their cells and exchange anxious glances. Parish priests hurriedly finish their morning masses. You learn that the machinery of fear begins turning the moment the first sentence of authority is proclaimed. A short time later, you travel to Rome's ancient streets where posters announce the names of the first inquisitors and the scope of their reach. Any person may be accused. Any person must answer. You see children clutch their mothers' robes, and old men whisper prayers beneath their breath. You learn that the power to brand another's beliefs becomes the greatest terror of all. At midday, you enter a small chamber where the first accused has been brought to stand trial. A local merchant stands before a panel of clerics. He trembles as his accusers name charges of denying church teaching on the bread and wine. You watch his eyes widen as the inquisitor reads from the new papal decree. You learn that knowledge of the law can terrify as much as ignorance, when the law itself wields the power of eternal judgment. You observe the inquiry that follows. The inquisitor questions the merchant alone in a fenced area to avoid scandal in public. Guards stand outside the fence, their eyes fixed on every movement. The merchant answers yes and no to each question, his voice quavering. You learn that once isolated, you become vulnerable both in body and in spirit. After questioning, the inquisitor calls the merchant's parish priest to testify. The priest recalls a sermon in which he warned of the dangers of false belief. He remembers a conversation in the market square where the merchant doubted the miracle of consecration. You learn that casual words once spoken in confidence can become evidence woven into a tapestry of accusation. By evening, the tribunal pronounces judgment. The merchant is forced to recant publicly in the market square. He must wear a badge marking his error and attend sermons read from the pulpit to reaffirm church teaching. You see him kneel before the crowd as prayers for his soul echo through the plaza. You learn that branding a person with public penance leaves a stain on their name that never fully fades. In the days that follow, you hear rumors of stricter measures. Some heretics may face imprisonment until they recant. Others may be handed over to secular courts for punishment that could include torture or death. You learn that the Inquisition's shadow extends beyond the tribunal into every realm where civil and church authorities join in enforcing orthodoxy. You visit a monastery to speak with friars who once welcomed pilgrims of every stripe. They now lock their doors when inquisitors arrive. Brothers who once studied ancient texts now copy confessions and compile lists of suspects. You learn that once the machinery of fear begins, it turns more swiftly than any scribe can record. Late at night, you walk the narrow cobbled streets by torchlight. You overhear conversations halting when someone steps near. You see a mother hushed as her child asks what a heretic is. You learn that fear travels in silence, and that every whispered question is a small spark that can kindle the fire of suspicion. In the palace, you meet with your confessor to unburden your soul of unease. You speak of the danger in granting such sweeping power. He reminds you that heresy threatens the fate of every believer, and that protecting souls demands both love and vigilance. You learn that even the machinery of fear is born of a desire to safeguard truth as each churchman sees it. A week later, you receive news that a noblewoman has died in prison before her case could conclude. She was accused of secretly sheltering preachers of condemned teachings. You learn that in haste to purge error, mercy can be left behind in dark cells. Out of sorrow, you call for reform. You urge inquisitors to treat every suspect with dignity and to allow counsel and witnesses to speak on their behalf. You learn that even as fear spreads, the seeds of mercy can take root in hearts guided by justice. At last, you stand once more in the grand hall before the Pope. You present your plea for balance between zeal and compassion. The Pope listens and nods, ordering that all inquisitors follow clear procedures and that any use of torture be approved only by the highest tribunal. You learn that power to judge belief must be tempered by humility, and that the machinery of fear can be guided by mercy as well as by severity. In the silence that follows, you feel the weight of souls both saved and lost. You vow to remember that every sentence passed in the name of God touches a human heart and shapes the faith of a world. You learn that the Inquisition's birth marks both the birth of a tool of orthodoxy and the seed of a discipline that must always walk the narrow path between justice and compassion. You return to the tribunal chamber before dawn, torches guttering along the walls. You find the Inquisitor pacing beside a small wooden table. Upon it lies a row of metal badges, etched with the word heretic. He presses one into your hand, its surface cold and heavy. You learn that this token will mark the first of many souls chosen to carry a public shame. Word spreads through the streets as the badges are nailed to the church door. Townsfolk gather in the square to watch the first wearer of the mark approach. They whisper prayers for his turnover and mutter curses for his disgrace. You learn that once the identity of the condemned is known, then curiosity and contempt become weapons of social exclusion. At sunrise, you stand in the crowded square to witness the ritual. The accused, a scholar who spoke of new interpretations of scripture, kneels before you. His hands tremble on the step of the pulpit. You strip his outer robe and drape the heretic badge upon his chest. You learn that the act of public humiliation transforms an error of belief into a crime against the community. A bell tolls, and the crowd steps back in fear and fascination. Some cross themselves, others lean forward to stare at the branded man. You feel the hush settle as every eye becomes an accomplice in the act of condemnation. You learn that the Inquisition's power lies not only in its courts, but in the spectacle of fear it creates. After the branding, the scholar is led to a small cell set within the church walls. He is given bread and water, but no visitors are allowed. Word swirls that his punishment will include forced labor or exile. You learn that leaving the defendant alive but broken can serve as both deterrent and demonstration. You convene the Inquisitor and his assistants in your study. You ask about the scholar's recantation. The Inquisitor tells you that the man swore to renounce his errors and to affirm the church's teaching. He swears his confession was sincere. You learn that recantation offers a path to mercy, but carries the shadow of doubt on every future prayer. That afternoon you visit the scholar in his cell. The door opens with a creak. Inside he kneels upon a straw mat and looks up at you with hollow eyes. You sense both relief and fear in his gaze. You speak to him of forgiveness and of penance. You learn that mercy given, after fear lingers, like a wound that aches in silence. You ask the Inquisitor about the next phase of penance. He describes a series of sermons the scholar must attend, and a pilgrimage he must undertake to a nearby shrine. You learn that even in restoration, the machinery of fear guides the steps, and that the branded soul remains marked until death. In the following weeks, you watch the lists of accused grow. Priests report neighbors who question church teachings. Merchant guilds whisper of members who practice forbidden rites. Children speak of rumors they hear in the streets. You learn that the Inquisition's reach extends into every aspect of life, and that suspicion breeds a culture of self-policing. Local magistrates send villagers accused of witchcraft or Jewry to the tribunal. They arrive in iron collars and hands bound. You stand before them in the morning light as they plead for mercy. You learn that heresy in belief can overlap with prejudice in practice, and that the Inquisition can become an instrument for every grievance. Late one night, you convene a private meeting with the Master Inquisitor. You speak of your growing concern that the campaign against heresy may devour the very faith it seeks to protect. He insists that harsh measures are necessary to maintain unity and to safeguard souls against eternal damnation. You learn that zealotry can blind the most righteous to the cost in human suffering. You open a copy of the decretal that authorized the tribunal. You read its clauses on due process and on the limits of punishment. You learn that the original intention included safeguards against abuse, yet that practice has outpaced principle in the fever to root out error. The next morning, you ride to a neighboring diocese, where rumors speak of secret prisons and nightly interrogations. You find a walled yard behind the bishop's palace where torches cast long shadows. There you see men and women shackled to iron posts and questioned by robed figures. You learn that once fear is sanctioned, it spreads in a ripple beyond any single court. In a small chapel, you kneel before a statue of Saint Dominic, founder of the order tasked with preaching and persuasion. You pray for guidance on how to temper judgment with compassion. You learn that even the most powerful tribunal must heed the call to mercy as the truest form of justice. That evening, you address the College of Cardinals. You speak of the need to restore balance between fear and love, between investigation and healing. You urge the assembly to temper the machinery of the Inquisition with every tool of pastoral care. You learn that leadership demands both courage to confront error and wisdom to show mercy where truth blooms in the heart. In the days that follow, you issue new regulations. Torture is to be used only as a last resort. Recantation must lead swiftly to restoration of rights. Branded badges are to be replaced by private admonitions wherever possible. You learn that reform within the Inquisition requires both decree and constant vigilance. You visit the scholar once more after his penance. He kneels in a simple chapel, praying for the souls he once led astray. You see tears in his eyes as he thanks you for mercy. You learn that the machinery of fear, when paired with acts of compassion, can lead from despair to redemption. In the months to come, you watch the tribunal's zeal cool in some regions and flare in others. You learn that the birth of the Inquisition marked both a turning point and a crossroad. The power to brand heresy remains an instrument of fear, yet also holds the potential, in the hands of mercy, to guide lost souls back to faith. In your final prayer of the day, you commit to bear the burden of this power with humility, and to remember that every judgment bears the weight of eternity upon a single soul. You learn that in the machinery of fear, the greatest hope lies in the choice to show mercy even as you seek truth. You awaken in the middle of the night to distant bells tolling at every basilica in Rome. Word has spread that another city has fallen ill and that the dead outnumber the living. You rise from your bed of velvet and walk through empty corridors to the private chapel. There you kneel before the altar and ask for guidance in the face of this great pestilence. You learn that as shepherd of Christendom, your first duty is to comfort your flock even as fear and grief sweep through every town and village. By morning, you convene your council of cardinals in the grand hall. Thick tapestries insulate the stones from the chill, but cannot hold back the fear that grips every heart. You speak of the need for prayer and penance, and propose that all churches in your realm ring their bells at sunset each day. You issue a plea that the faithful confess their sins and seek absolution so that divine mercy might turn aside the scourge. You learn that in the face of suffering, ritual can bring a moment of unity and hope even when the cause of plague remains hidden. Soon you receive letters from distant bishops reporting flagrant cases of mob violence. Communities desperate for a scapegoat have turned against their Jewish neighbors and against itinerant lepers. You learn that fear can drive the faithful to savage acts, and that your role as Pope demands not only spiritual counsel but moral authority to condemn injustice. You dispatch envoys to every province with a papal bull ordering protection for the vulnerable and stern penalties for vigilantes who attack the innocent. You learn that words of holiness must be backed by the power of your office to save lives as well as souls. Meanwhile, your treasurer brings grim news of dwindling tithes. With so many dead and so many unable to work, the collection of church revenue has fallen by half. You debate with your chamberlain whether to suspend certain levies or to dip into reserves meant for rebuilding churches. You decide to release funds from the papal patrimony to feed the poor in Rome and to pay for medical care for the sick. You learn that a shepherd must feed his flock even at the cost of his own purse. In the days that follow, you lead a great procession through the streets. You walk barefoot in simple robes, carrying a silver cross before you. The faithful follow in silence, chanting psalms for deliverance. You pause at each gate and bless the souls inside. You learn that symbols of humility can restore faith when human knowledge fails, and that a pope in procession can embody the mercy he preaches. Despite your prayers and processions, the plague continues its deadly sweep. Town after town falls silent, You consult with physicians who treat the afflicted with rare herbs and poultices. They confess that their art is powerless against the disease. You learn that medicine alone cannot cure what faith and fate alike have brought. In private, you wrestle with the thought that perhaps this calamity is a divine punishment for the sins of Christendom. You recall the crusades left unfinished and the heresies once tolerated. You issue a call for a universal fast and for charity toward all your neighbors. You learn that collective penance can bring peace of mind even if the heavens remain sealed. Rumors reach you that some cardinals seek to flee Rome for their own estates. You learn that panic can claim even those closest to the throne. You deliver a stern message forbidding any bishop or cardinal to abandon his diocese. You remind them that a shepherd who leaves his flock in peril forfeits his own place before God. You learn that leadership demands presence in the worst of times. As the death toll rises, you oversee the construction of mass graves beyond the city walls. You see the exhausted workers lowering coffin upon coffin into common pits. You learn that dignity in burial becomes a distant dream when so many perish so quickly. You order prayers at each burial site and ask that names be recorded so that each soul might be remembered in the book of life. In the final weeks of your pontificate, you find strength in small moments of mercy. You bless a child whose parents have both died and shield him from the guards who would seize church property to pay debts. You comfort a widow who fears her home will be seized by creditors now that her husband lies dead. You learn that holiness shines in acts of compassion when the world seems draped in grief. When at last the plague begins to abate, you convene a mass in the great basilica to give thanks for the end of the pestilence. You stand beneath the dome and raise your voice in a prayer of gratitude. The faithful fill the pews, many weeping tears of relief. You learn that the shepherd's final duty in crisis is to lead his flock from the valley of death into the light of hope once more. You awaken one morning to a tide of anxious whispers echoing through the papal palace. Word has spread that cardinals have refused to accept the death of the late pope as final. Rumors swirl of rival claims and of voices raised in outrage. You learn that when trust in a single throne cracks, then the unity of the church trembles in the balance. At dawn, you convene the College of Cardinals in the Great Hall. You see two lines of red robes facing one another like rival armies. You learn that disagreement over the rightful successor has led to a fracture so deep that two men now claim the seat of Peter. One sits in Rome and the other in Avignon. You feel the shock of betrayal in every gaze. You rise to speak and call for calm. You remind the assembly that Christ prayed for unity among his followers. You urge both sides to negotiate a single election that all might accept. Yet you sense that pride and political allegiance have hardened hearts. You learn that when spiritual authority divides, then secular power cannot remain neutral. Outside the hall, you find envoys from the King of France and from the Holy Roman Emperor, locked in whispered conferences. Each claims to have the right to back a candidate whose policies favor his own realm. You learn that rival crowns feed the schism with every demand and promise, turning a spiritual crisis into a clash of kingdoms. As the days pass, a third group of cardinals breaks away and elects a third pope in a remote abbey. You learn that the fracture has become a chasm. 3 men now sit beneath triple tiaras, each armed with bulls of excommunication against his rivals. You feel the world slipping into chaos, as orders used to bind the faithful now condemn them, depending on whom they follow. In Rome, you witness processions led by one claimant. Priests march through the streets bearing his banner and preaching obedience. You learn that every act of devotion for one pope becomes an act of rebellion against the others. Families split over allegiance, and towns become battlegrounds of belief. In Avignon, the second pope hosts courts of petition. He draws scholars and clerics who teach under his authority. You learn that universities become centers of partisan debate, and that the very study of theology turns to quarrel rather than to contemplation. In the shadowed corners of Europe, a third claimant's name spreads. He takes refuge in a distant fortress. You learn that desperation breeds unlikely alliances, and that the poorest baron may offer lodging in exchange for a promise of papal favor. You convene your own small council in secret. You meet with loyal cardinals who fear for the future of the church. You discuss the possibility of deposing all three claimants and holding a fresh election under new rules. You learn that only a bold and impartial act might restore unity, but that such a solution demands the cooperation of crowns that fueled the schism. Meanwhile, the faithful suffer. In a village, you meet a priest who trembles at the sight of 3 crucifixes displayed in his church, each representing a different pope. He fears that every mass he celebrates risks drawing the ire of one claimant or another. You learn that the cost of division falls hardest on humble souls who seek only to pray in peace. A merchant in a trading town tells you that his caravans must now carry 3 sets of letters of safe conduct signed by each pope. He pays tribute to all, and yet fears bandits who prey on his confusion. You learn that the schism turns even commerce into a maze of loyalty tests and toll booths. You travel to a border fortress where a bishop negotiates the ransom of captives with each claimant's emissaries. He tells you that he must pay 3 times over to secure release for the condemned. You learn that the machinery of mercy grinds under 3 masters, and that even the pardon of a thief becomes a form of political taxation. In a remote monastery, you find a scribe copying a tract that argues for compromise. He outlines a plan for mutual resignation and for election of a single pope acceptable to all. You learn that voices of reason emerge in every generation, yet that reason alone cannot overcome the tools of fear and power wielded by the divided court. Late one night, you pace beneath the frescoed ceilings of the papal residence. You recall your own oaths to serve the church and to uphold the unity of the flock. You feel the weight of every soul divided by allegiance and every family torn by loyalty. You learn that spiritual wounds cut deeper than any sword. In the halls below, you find envoys from the emperor and from the King of France locked in heated argument. They accuse one another of fomenting the schism for territorial gain. You decide that only relinquishing political influence over papal elections can heal the rift. You learn that power shared with secular rulers becomes power betrayed when crowns seek advantage. The next dawn, you issue a bull calling for unconditional resignations by all 3 claimants. You propose the convocation of a general council with delegates from every kingdom to elect a single pope. You learn that sweeping gestures carry risk when rival courts refuse to set aside their claims. In the following weeks, the call for unity spreads through conciliar circles. You see bishops and theologians debating the theology of a council's authority versus that of a single pontiff. You learn that the crisis has forced the church to confront not only its external foes, but the question of its own governance. As the council convenes in a distant city, you attend by proxy. You watch as representatives of divided courts exchange pledges to accept the outcome. You learn that unity demands sacrifice, as each claimant must relinquish his claim and embrace humility. At last, the council declares that all 3 must step down. A new pontiff is elected with wide consensus. The church's banners are raised once more under a single cross. You learn that the schism's end renews the unity of faith, yet leaves scars that endure in memory and in mistrust. When the new pope returns to Rome, you stand in the crowd and feel hope stir in many hearts. Yet you also carry the lesson that spiritual authority must remain above the ambitions of kings and the fears of fallible men. You learn that the Western Schism taught the Church that unity cannot be taken for granted, and that only constant vigilance and humble service can guard against the fracture of souls. You awaken before dawn to the clang of a hammer in the workshop beyond your chambers. Through the window, you see masons shaping marble blocks by torchlight. You learn that the Renaissance papacy transformed Rome into a living cathedral of art, even as it drained the coffers meant for charity. As you dress in your finest robes, you recall the day you first laid eyes on the dome of St. Peter rising above the city. You felt awe at the vision of Michelangelo's design, and a thrill at the thought that your pontificate would shape its completion. You learn that artistic patronage became the badge of a cultured pope, even as every scaffold cost fortunes drawn from tithes and indulgences. In the private chapel, you kneel before an ancient wooden crucifix. You pray for guidance as the world outside shifts under murals of prophets and sibyls. You learn that commissioning great art can inspire the faithful, yet also seduce leaders into vanity. Your first audience of the morning is with the Master of Works. He presents models by Bramante for the new facade of St. Peter's. The design is grand and revolutionary. You hear the promise of glory in every column and pediment. You learn that building a monument to the church's power can overshadow the simple needs of the poor who pray beneath it each day. Next, you meet with Raphael, whose frescoes in the Vatican Palace draw visitors from every court. He bows and thanks you for your support. He asks for funds to expand his workshop and to hire additional apprentices. You approve a generous stipend. You learn that patronage elevates art and artists even as it fosters dependency on papal favor. Outside, the streets of Rome bustle with merchants selling sketches and prints of your commissioned works. You hear whispers that the cost of commissioning these masters exceeds the annual income of several bishoprics. You learn that papal avarice finds its justification in the promise of cultural immortality. Back in your study, your treasurer awaits with grim news. He shows ledgers where the sale of indulgences brought in coin for building projects, yet left the poor unable to secure basic church services. You learn that funding art through spiritual commerce invites scandal when the faithful see a gulf between gilded chapels and starving widows. In the consistory, you face questions from reform-minded cardinals. They urge you to curb the sale of spiritual favors and to redirect revenues to hospitals and orphanages. You listen as they speak of Christ's call to care for the least. You learn that moral courage demands balancing grandeur with charity. That afternoon you walk the newly completed loggia where Raphael's tapestries hang. You study the figures woven in silk and gold thread. You recall the pride you felt when foreign ambassadors praised your enlightened rule. You learn that artistic triumphs can elevate a papacy's reputation even as they deepen the gulf between palace splendor and popular need. In the workshop, you inspect marble columns hewn for the new basilica. You feel the smooth, cool stone under your fingertips. You remember the pledges of alms made by knights turned away from the Jubilee year. You learn that the urgency of construction can overshadow the urgency of mercy. When evening falls, you host a banquet for architects and artists. You dine beneath paintings of gods and saints mingling in the vaulted ceilings. You raise your glass and toast their genius. They bow and speak of your vision. You learn that flattery flows as freely as wine in a court devoted to beauty. After the banquet, you retire to your private oratory. You light a single candle and open your breviary. You ask forgiveness for any vanity that led you to build monuments more for your own glory than for the glory of God. You learn that self-reflection must temper ambition if spiritual authority is to endure. The next day you attend Mass in a chapel whose walls Michelangelo has yet to paint. You gaze upward at the bare plaster. You imagine the scenes of prophets soon to appear. You learn that commissioning a masterpiece demands patience and burdened the workers whose wages also came from church funds. In your council, you approve pensions for struggling artists and apprentices displaced by rising costs. Some cardinals praise your generosity. Others mutter that art has become a new religion that draws resources away from the church's true mission. You learn that patronage can nourish culture, even as it sows discord over priorities. At dusk, you walk the streets and see beggars at every corner. You recall the days of simpler devotion when churches offered bread and ale to the needy. You learn that artistic splendor cannot fill empty stomachs, and that true beauty shines brightest in acts of compassion. In secret, you commission a chapel to house refugees fleeing plague and war. You instruct that its walls remain unadorned, so that all may feel welcome without awe or shame. You learn that humility and patronage can restore balance when opulence risks the church's soul. When the day of the great dedication arrives, you stand before the crowds and bless the new basilica's foundations. Trumpets sound and choirs sing. You feel the weight of history on your shoulders and the promise of legacy in every stone. You learn that the Renaissance papacy stands at the crossroads of faith and art, and that its true measure lies not only in grandeur, but in the love and mercy shown to the least of these. You wake one morning to the clatter of running feet and the urgent rustle of letters arriving at the papal palace. A courier from Wittenberg stands before you with a thick parchment, bearing a new treatise circulated across Germany. You learn that Martin Luther, a monk turned professor, has nailed his 95 propositions to the church door and ignited a flame of dissent that no candle of Rome can easily extinguish. By mid-morning, you convene your council of cardinals in the consistory hall. They file in with grave faces and copies of Luther's theses in hand. You learn that his charges strike at the very heart of papal authority, the sale of indulgences, the power of the keys, and the role of grace. You ask each to speak, and they warn that Luther's challenge could fracture the church beyond repair. That afternoon you meet with the master of the sacred palace and the theologians who guard doctrine. You hear their analysis that Luther's arguments are both novel and dangerous. He refuses to retract unless Scripture itself can be shown to dissent. You learn that when a scholar appeals to Scripture over tradition, he places the papacy's claims at risk. In the evening, you hold a public audience in the basilica. You rise beneath the golden mosaics and speak of the need for order and faith. You condemn public posting of disputes as a breach of church discipline and call on Luther to present his concerns through proper channels. You learn that maintaining authority demands both firmness and the appearance of respect for theology. Over the following weeks, copies of Luther's work spread like wildfire across Europe. You see merchants and students study his Latin verses, and clergy whisper in taverns about the gospel rediscovered. You learn that printing presses have become tools of reform, and that the pulpit is no longer the only pulpit. You dispatch envoys to Wittenberg with letters of summons ordering Luther to Rome to answer for his writings. You learn that compelling a German monk to journey through hostile lands carries both political and spiritual peril. You must weigh the risk of inflaming his cause against the need to confront him directly. Meanwhile, word reaches you of a debate in Leipzig where Luther bested his opponents on points of doctrine. You learn that his skill in debate draws attention away from papal bulls and toward questions of faith. Theologians, once secure in their training, now find themselves on the defensive. In Rome, you see the faithful divided. Merchants in the market speak of religious renewal, while guild members worry that social order will unravel. You learn that a crisis of authority shakes every rung of society, and that the papacy's authority must be both asserted and renewed. You call a session of cardinals to consider drafting a decree against heresy in Germany. Some urge immediate condemnation. Others caution that heavy-handed measures will only deepen rebellion. You learn that power balanced by prudence may yet heal schism. You meet with ambassadors from the Holy Roman Emperor. He offers to convene a diet to settle disputes if you will declare Luther an outlaw. You learn that secular rulers see opportunity to extend their own power under the guise of restoring church unity. In private, you wrestle with the decision. You recall the triumphs of past councils and the wounds left by conciliar movements. You fear that calling a general council prematurely might undermine papal primacy. You learn that every response risks conceding ground to one rival or another. At last you issue the papal bull Exsurge Domine, condemning Luther's propositions and threatening excommunication if he does not recant within 60 days. You learn that bulls carry the weight of divine wrath, and that censure can both rally obedience and provoke further defiance. In Germany, you see Luther publicly burn the bull. You learn that rejecting papal authority in such a dramatic act draws crowds and cements his status as an adversary of the court. His followers chant hymns at his side, and you learn that charisma can outshine edicts. Reports arrive of Luther translating the Bible into German, so that common folk may read the word for themselves. You learn that when scripture enters the vernacular, the gap between clergy and laity narrows, and the papacy's role as interpreter comes under threat. You convene a second consistory and debate steps to enforce the bull. Some cardinals propose a crusade against heresy in Germany. You learn that wielding spiritual weapons against fellow Christians demands caution, lest fratricide stain the church's banner. In your study, you pray for guidance. You confess that you fear the loss of unity more than any heretic outside your doors. You learn that humility before God and charity towards souls are the antidotes to the pride that fuels division. You decide to call a council at Trent to address reform and doctrine. You issue letters throughout Christendom inviting kings, princes, and prelates to convene. You learn that a council offers the hope of reconciliation, yet risks empowering secular and conciliar forces. As invitations depart, you ride through Rome and see the city's artists prepare frescoes celebrating the one true church. You learn that the Renaissance papacy's zeal for beauty must now give way to the labor of reform and renewal. In the final days before your council, you gather with trusted advisors to craft decrees on indulgences, clerical corruption, and the primacy of the Pope. You balance calls for stricter enforcement with promises of mercy. You learn that the dawn of Reformation demands wisdom to guide the Church toward healing rather than toward further fracture. You sit alone in the private chapel of your palace, as the candle's flame flickers against the stone walls. Before you lies the simple wooden cross that Peter once carried. You place your hand upon its rough beam and feel the weight of centuries pressing down upon your soul. Across that timber, the keys of the kingdom of heaven were first entrusted. You learn that to bear those keys is to carry both divine promise and human peril. From the moment you first placed your hand upon the book of the Gospels until this final hour, you have known that every decision you issued could lead souls towards salvation or push them into despair. You recall the early days of your pontificate when you trembled beneath the weight of that book and promised to uphold the faith. You learned then that holy power brings endless hazards in equal measure to its great authority. You remember the gathering of feudal lords who sought your blessing for their wars and your censure of their enemies. You felt the burden of judging peace and conflict not by earthly law but by eternal decree. You stood before armies and anointed princes who believed the papal sanction overnight conferred both divine right and military might. You learned that the very act of blessing a campaign blurred the line between shepherd and sovereign. You recall the day the Black Death descended upon the lands you served. Bells tolled at every dawn and dusk as the faithful prayed for relief. You led processions and called for penance to turn aside the plague's fury. You knew then that words of comfort could ease the pain of the living, yet could never fully lift the terror born of silent death. You learned that the tiara's weight grows heaviest when lives hang in balance, and no human effort can avert fate. You remember the struggle of the Western Schism when 3 men claimed the throne you once held alone. You convened councils and issued bulls to call for unity. You saw study halls devour theology and saw entire flocks falter before rival claimants. You learned that the greatest hazard lies not in foreign armies, but in the tearing of the church's fabric by human pride. You recall commissioning great works of art, even as the poor clamored at the gates for food and care. You felt pride in marble and paint, yet bitterness in every ledger that showed the sale of indulgences to finance palaces. You learned that patronage can decorate the house of God and also expose its flaws to the cries of the needy. You recall the rise of reformers who challenged your authority with the word of God and by appeal to Scripture itself. You issued edicts and called for reconciliation at councils that replaced the power of the tiara with the power of the word. You learned that faith, once hidden in cloistered halls, finds voice in every tongue, and that holy power must bend to ever-shifting expressions of devotion. You recall the founding of the first Inquisitions and the machinery of fear they unleashed upon those accused of error. You saw the badge of heretic and the chains of the cell. You heard the cries that came in the name of preserving truth. You learned that to brand a soul as fallen is to brand the church itself with the stain of fear. You recall the exile to Avignon and the slow gilding of your tiara in lands ruled by foreign crowns. You felt the chill of foreign courts upon your shoulders and the weight of banners that flew beside your own. You learned that independence, once taken for granted, can vanish at the request of an army sent to guard your palace. Through every trial, you clung to the belief that the keys you carried opened the gates of heaven. Yet you felt the paradox that those same keys could lock hearts in fear and twist souls in bitterness. You learned that to guide a flock demands both the gift of authority and the grace to wield it with humility. Now you look upon the simple cross before you and repent of the arrogance that once sought to shape doctrine by mandate rather than by humble counsel. You honor the martyrs who laid down their lives rather than recant conscience. You recall the saints who labored in silence to heal the wounds your edicts sometimes deepened. You learn that the burden of the keys is not in the office you bear, but in the lives entrusted to your care. As you prepare to lay aside the tiara, you review every risk you took with it. You remember guiding crusades across deserts and seas, and you remember the widows left behind in the wake of every call to arms. You remember summoning reformers to councils and seeing divisions widen rather than mend. You recall blessing kings and forbidding princes, and you learned that every word could ignite kingdoms and unmake alliances. You remember the tears of the dying, and you remember the prayers of the living. You remember the construction of splendid chapels, and you remember the soup kitchens left empty in their shadow. You learned that the paradox of holy power lies in its potential to both bless and to blind. You kneel before the cross and offer a final prayer. You cast aside thoughts of grandeur and ambition. You pray for mercy for every soul you guided, and for forgiveness where your edicts led to harm. You vow that the next bearer of the keys will know both the hazards you faced and the hope you cherished. You rise and lift the cross from its stand. You carry it from the chapel into the dawn light. You step outside into the quiet courtyard and feel the sun's warmth upon your brow. You learn that the burden of the keys remains with the office, even when the tiara is laid down. You hand the cross to your successor with hands that tremble but eyes that shine with hope. You speak the words of blessing you first heard at your coronation. You learn that while authority may pass from one to another, the shepherd's charge to guide the flock with love and humility endures across all time. You watch as the new pope raises the keys high and speaks to the waiting faithful. You feel the weight of every temptation he will face, and you feel the warmth of every prayer he will offer. You learn that only the desperate or the driven embrace the tiara's burden, for to carry it is to accept a life measured by both the glory of service and the cost of every soul entrusted to the care of the one who bears the key.